Hey, good morning, everybody. Morning, Rabbi Jill.
Good morning.
Good to see you.
Good morning. Here.
So I think we have all we're starting to get our Zoom people from outside the church. What we're waiting for now mainly is the parish hall here at St. John's to join us. So I did send a text about that. Jill, did you get my text? I used the number in your email. I don't know if that's your office number or your
I think
cell.
it's my office number.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, you're here, so I'm least worried
I'm
about
here.
you.
Was there
Yeah, so
something
it's
else
just-
was there something else I needed to know that I might not have gotten?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
It's really just the people in the parish hall now, and so the other two ladies on the text are Nancy Adams and Lisa Reisner, and they're over in the parish hall. But we were saying farewell, congratulations to the high school seniors, and then farewell to a lady named Karen who worked in the office for 8 years. And then they're having cake over in the lobby, and Sari, our rector, can't join us because there's something going on in the lounge. So it's he was just helping me make sure I logged in here. I'm in his office here at St. John's, but so everything's good except for the parish hall. That's the only thing we're waiting for. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna mute myself and walk over there just to make sure they're doing all right. It's just a couple of minutes.
Kurt, we are just
Yes.
gathering. We're just beginning to gather. So if you could give us another couple of minutes, that's great.
Oh, hey, Nancy. Okay, great. I see Nave big screen, so that must be you guys.
Yeah, people are still celebrating Karen, so they're right outside.
Okay.
Okay,
All
I'll,
right.
I'll announce that we're starting, okay?
Okay, thank you. Rabbi Jill, how's the weather in New York? We're having kind of a heat
It's
wave.
hot. It's
Yeah.
hot. Yeah, it was like over 90 yesterday, and I think today it's in the 80s. How about there? It's probably worse.
Let me see. I was just out. I'm in a running group, and we hosted a race this morning. I had to leave early to be here. It's 83 now here.
Wow.
It was me and a couple of other guys got there at 5 a.m. to run like 4 miles before the race. It was 73 degrees at 5 a.m.
Wow, that's kind of miserable for this time of year.
Not pleasant.
No.
So hopefully it'll just be
Apparently
another
the
minute.
camera here isn't working, so
Oh,
we now have a number of people here if you'd like to begin.
okay, and is Lisa
Lisa's here.
Lisa working on the camera?
No, the camera guy said that he would have to do something more fundamental, so that's not going to happen apparently. So let's
Okay.
go with the audio, and I'll try to moderate if people have questions and get them up here. Okay?
Super. Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Nancy. So I just want to welcome Rabbi Jill, welcoming you to join us here today, and all our congregants who are zoomed in the parish hall and from your homes. This is the second in our two-part series that started earlier this month on human rights advocacy in the Holy Land. The first session was the one with Jonathan Kutab of Friends of Sabile North America. So basically I'll introduce Rabbi Jill. She'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. And you can either, if you're out at home, you can either use the little hand raising icon or drop a question into the chat. And and we'll handle Q&A that way. We'll go on till about it's 11, a little after 11:20. We'll go on for about an hour, trying to make sure everybody who gets has a question gets the opportunity to ask it. And the session is recorded, so anybody who misses anything, including Sari already asked, he wants to see the recording later. And yeah, so so the session's recorded and we'll go ahead and get started. Rabbi Jill Jacobs is a prominent human rights leader. She's the CEO of TRUA. It's a rabbinical human rights organization. And as CEO, she's responsible for training and mobilizing over 2,300 rabbis and cantors and their communities, bringing a moral voice to promoting human rights in North America, as well as Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. She's a book author. She's authored Where Justice Dwells, a hands-on guide to doing social justice in your Jewish community, and There Shall Be No Needy, pursuing social justice through Jewish law and tradition. She's been named to Forward's list of 50 influential American Jews and to Newsweek's list of the 50 most influential rabbis in America. Jill holds an MA in Talmud from the Jewish Theological Seminary and an MS in Urban Affairs from Hunter College, as well as a BA from Columbia. She lives in New York with her husband, Rabbi Guy Austrian, and their 2 daughters. So Jill, welcome again, and we'll just turn the floor over to you for some remarks.
Thank you so much, Kirk. It's really nice to be here. Sorry, it's not in person, but this is the world we're in right now. So I want to run through a bunch of different subjects on probably a very surface level, but then we'll go deeper in the questions. So what I want to do in the next 20 minutes or so is I want to talk a little bit about my own story and relationship to Israel, what TRUA does, and then the question that came up that was posed to me about how to talk about Israel-Palestine human rights within progressive communities, and particularly within Christian communities, without falling into anti-Semitism. And so, which is a very tricky and complicated question. So I'm going to skim the surface of everything, and then you all can ask questions to go deeper into anything that is that feels relevant or interesting, or that you want to just jump more into. So in terms of my own story, I grew up in a family that was deeply involved in our Jewish community outside of Boston, also deeply involved in Israel. I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s. And so what that meant is I spent time starting from when I was 6, visiting Israel, studying Hebrew. That was very important to my family, to be able to be connected in that way through Hebrew. And it also means that some of the key moments of my life, I know people are coming from different generations, so many of you will remember these. So for me, one of the first key moments of my life that, from my childhood was the first Intifada, and watching it on TV and trying to understand what was happening, and hearing the story from my family of, well, they hate us and that's why they're throwing rocks. Okay, so later I was able to unpack that a little bit more, but that was certainly part of the story I grew up with. Also, understanding as a very little kid the peace agreement with Egypt and the Sinai and the withdrawal from the Sinai. So also I remember as a little kid understanding that some big things were going on and not really understanding exactly what was happening. But really the key moment for me growing up was Oslo, which was happening when I was in late high school and college. And and that was that moment of incredible hope that finally there might be peace. We know now many reasons that Oslo fell apart and was never implemented, but having that sense that peace was actually possible and that we could hold on to that. And then just the crushing despair that happened with the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, the attacks on buses, the terror attacks by Palestinian extremists, that killed people, including a college friend of mine and her boyfriend. And just that sense of there was a possibility, and now there is just utter despair. So a little bit later in my development, my connection to the place, in 2000, 2001, I was in Israel studying during my rabbinical school year. There's usually a year of rabbinical school that happens in Jerusalem. So I was there 2000, 2001. I landed just a few days after the Second Intifada started. We didn't know it was going to be the Second Intifada, but I landed after that started. And that year, I had a very complicated experience of, on the one hand, being terrified for my life and that of my friends. For those of you who remember that time, there were, especially in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other parts of Israel, there were terror attacks on buses and malls and cafes and a nightclub where teenagers were. And there was just this real fear that we were going to be killed, or somebody we loved was going to be killed just for going out for coffee or for dinner. And at the same time, I started to learn more for the first time about the experience of Palestinians and understanding that they were under closure and subject to collective punishment because of the actions of a few people, and really starting to understand that story. And I spent some time, not that year, but the following year, coming back and visiting East Jerusalem and spending time with a family, a Palestinian family whose home had been destroyed, and learning about the experience of Palestinians who are unable to build or just to live the kind of lives that everybody wants to live, where we just, go to work and take your kids to school and the things that we all want out of life. But instead we're dealing with home demolitions and attempts to push them out of their homes. And so that really continued for me over many years of spending time both in Israel and also in the West Bank. I was back for a year in 2009, 2010, spent a lot of time in the West Bank. Then again, really understanding what occupation looks like on the ground, what the experience of Palestinians living under military occupation is. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the details of that, because I think that you've been talking about, I can, of course, answer questions about what that looks like, but I know that you all have been talking about that a lot in your church. But just to say that for me, it was very much this process of really understanding the day-to-day life of Palestinians, and also having been immersed in the day-to-day life of Israeli Jews, as well as getting to know Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so that process eventually led me to become the CEO of Trua, which is this year, actually this week, celebrating our 20th anniversary. We started in 2002. I became the CEO in 2011, so about halfway through the lifetime of the organization. And Trua, as you heard, organizes more than 2,300 rabbis and cantors around the US and Canada to work on human rights issues, both here at home. 50% of our work is here at home, so I'm not going to talk about that today. But so you know, we work on issues of incarceration, worker justice, and immigration in the United States primarily. Sometimes we do some work also in Canada. And then 50% of our work is protecting the human rights of everybody in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. So that includes Israeli Jews, it includes Palestinian citizens of Israel, and it includes, of course, Palestinians living under occupation. So I've been CEO for 11 years now of Trua. So we organize rabbis and their communities around specific campaigns to protect human rights. We train rabbis and rabbinical students to be human rights leaders. I just got back, I was just in Israel about a week and a half ago, spending time with, we have a year-long program for rabbinical students who are spending their year in Israel, like I did 20 years ago, where every month we take them to see something on the ground. So they'll go and visit the West Bank with both Palestinian and Israeli human rights and civil society leaders. They'll visit with Palestinian citizens of Israel. They'll visit with Israeli Mizrahi activists, so Israelis whose families have origins in North Africa or the Arab world. They visit with asylum seekers, African asylum seekers. So they're really all over the country understanding the human rights issues, and really crucially also meeting the people who are doing the work, because we want them to walk away not only feeling like, wow, things are very hard here, but feeling also there's people in both Israeli and Palestinian society who are working every day to make life better. So this is the work that Trua does. We partner primarily with Israeli human rights organizations. We also partner with Palestinians when people are willing to partner with Jewish organizations. Our advocacy includes working to stop settlement expansion, working to stop the investment of money from Jewish community organizations and settlements, working to stop the entrenchment of occupation, as I mentioned, teaching both rabbis and future rabbis about the realities on the ground for Palestinians, as particularly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. We as an organization, just so you know where we stand, we believe that two states is the most viable way to achieve human rights for all people. That includes the right to freedom of movement, includes the right to citizenship in a country. Not everybody has the right to citizenship in a country, but as much as I would love like Danish or Canadian citizenship, it's not necessarily my right, but I do have the right for citizenship in a country. So everybody has the right to citizenship. Everybody has the right to self-determination, and to see for Palestinians and also Israeli Jews to see their desires for self-determination through the establishment of a state that protects them. So that's where we stand. We think that two states is the most viable. We also believe that reasonable people can argue about other possible solutions, whether it's one state, a confederation, other kinds of a sort of European Union kind of model that's been proposed, as long as, this is really crucial, as long as it's grounded in the protection of the human rights of all people, as long as it starts with the people on the ground and says, first of all, there's roughly 14 million people on the ground in that region. That includes about 9 million Israelis, 80% of whom are Jewish, more or less, about 20% of whom are Palestinian citizens, as well as 5 million Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So as long as you say there's 14 million people there, every single one of them has the exact same right to human rights that everyone else in the world has just by virtue of being human. And any solution has to protect the human rights of all of those people, none of whom are getting thrown into the sea, none of whom are going anywhere. Then we can argue about what the solutions are. So we can talk more about that, but we land that two states is the most viable. So that's what Shura does and where we are. I want to talk about one of the specific questions that Kirk and some of the others posed to me is about how to talk about Israel, Palestine, and human rights in that region in progressive communities, particularly in Christian communities, and particularly how to deal with the question of anti-Semitism and when does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitism and when is it not. So the first thing I want to say, I just said that we have to start with the human rights of all people. I cannot emphasize that enough, that we need to start, all of us, no matter where we're coming from, saying that we don't want any more people to die in that region. We want everybody to be able to have the kind of life that we all want. You wake up in the morning, you go to work. If you have kids, you drop them at school, you come home, you have dinner, you go to the grocery store. Just that's what most people in the world want. You get to do your hobbies, you get to see your family, you get to have your citizenship, have self-determination. So we want to start with the human rights of all people in that region. The second piece that is really important, particularly for those of us who are coming from the progressive side of things, and particularly for Christian communities, is to understand why Israel matters to Jews. And so I want to start, I am not going to try to give a whole history of Judaism or Zionism or Israel. That would take like semesters long courses, but I'm going to give the 5-minute version to say that when we talk about what Judaism is, Jews first don't see ourselves as just a religion in the Western Protestant sense of religion. So when Jews talk about ourselves, the most common word that we use is Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. We talk about ourselves as a people, and peoplehood includes religious practices for sure. It includes and beliefs. It also includes history. It includes languages. So Hebrew is our sacred language, but also many, many other languages that Jews spoke in different places where we lived that were usually some combination of some version of the local language with Hebrew influences. And it includes a connection to a place, to what we call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, which is the place in which the Jewish community came together, emerged. It's a place that Jews, where Jews were able to live until the I mean, I'm not going to go through all of Jewish history, but essentially two of the major crisis moments in Jewish history were the destruction of the first temple, and then in the 6th century of before the Common Era, and then ultimately the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, and the dispersion of Jewish communities, so that the destruction of the place that had been the main site of Jewish practice, the dispersion of Jewish communities, ultimately throughout the world. So since that time, so really for 2,000 years, Jewish communities have continued to pray for the return to Israel, for the rebuilding of the temple 3 times a day. We have multiple holidays that are formed around that. And just to give you a little bit of a picture, again, because sometimes people sort of gloss over this or say it's not, oh, Judaism has no connection to Israel or something like that. I just want to give you a little picture of the holiday of Tisha B'Av, which is the holiday, it's in the summer on the 9th of the Jewish month of Av, that commemorates the destruction of both temples and also commemorates some other events in Jewish history, but essentially the destruction of the temple. So if you walk into a synagogue on Tisha B'Av, what you'll see is, first of all, nobody will say hello to you. And it's not because they're being rude. It's because it's part of the practice that we don't do like chit chat and just, hey, how are you doing? That it's a time of mourning. So nobody will say hello to you, and it's not because they don't like you or they don't want to talk to you, but that's the tradition. When you come in, the room will be dark. People will be sitting on the floor, often with little candles or tea lights, depending on the safety precautions, and chanting from the Book of Lamentations, followed by chanting what are called keynote or dirges, lamentations for the destruction of the temple. And I want to just say that to say that this is something that in Jewish communities for 2,000 years, we've maintained this sense of mourning for the temple. And I should say it's also a fast day. It's a 25-hour fast day, so people will be fasting. And there's many, many other practices that happen during that day, as well as several other fast days that also commemorate the events leading up to the destruction of the temple. And so this is really important because sometimes when people want to talk about, in the progressive world, want to talk about Zionism, they say, oh, well, it has nothing to do with Judaism. Israel, Judaism is only a religion. It has nothing to do with the land of Israel. And it's just fundamentally not true. And so it's really important to acknowledge that the land of Israel is essential to Judaism and has always been essential to Judaism. And that is present in really 3 times a day of our prayer, as well as many, many holidays that happen during the year. And so the question of Zionism, is Zionism a break from tradition or is it a continuation? This is something that people, I would say people on both sides tend to ignore some of the nuances and try to give pat answers. So you hear on the left, sometimes you'll hear, well, Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, and even to the point of ignoring, as I said, the Jewish connection to the land of Israel. And then you hear sometimes on the right, Zionism is essential to Judaism. There's no distinction between Zionism. Zionism is just a continuation of Jewish history. And both sides are wrong. And I want to say both sides are too simplistic because Zionism was both a continuation and a departure. So in the 19th century, this is the moment of nationalism. It's the moment of minority rights when lots of minorities are fighting for their national rights in the places where they are. So if, for example, the Polish minority living in Germany is fighting for its rights, or the Lithuanian minority living in Russian Empire is fighting for its rights, right? Everybody's fighting for their national rights, generally inside of whatever empire or country that they're living in. This is also going to be the beginning of the time of nation states. And often there was a tit for tat. So Germany says, you know what, we'll protect the Polish minority inside of Germany if you'll, Poland, protect the German minority inside of Poland, right? There's a kind of tit for tat. And Jews are in a complicated situation because we don't have a country, a nation state in the same way as some others. And there's a debate, but Jews are fight for our national rights as well. And there's, so first of all, there's a debate within Judaism about, well, does that mean the national rights within a state? So if there's going to be Lithuanian schools and Latvian schools, like let's have Jewish schools and Jewish political parties and Jewish national rights within a larger either emerging nation state or empire. Or the question of like, well, maybe we can't, if we don't have a state like all the others, then we don't actually have any, we're not secure in our ability to physically exist and continue to live in these places. I'll talk about that in a second about the history of anti-Semitism. And so Zionism emerges as not exactly a break from the past and also a break from the past. So traditionally when Jews would pray for a return to the land of Israel, the assumption, belief was that that would happen through divine intervention, that God at some point would bring us back in a messianic era or whenever God chose to bring us back. And it was not something that we could bring about ourselves. So the break with tradition of Zionism was to say, we don't actually have to wait for divine intervention. We're going to use modern political means, whether it was appealing to the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire or later in the British Empire after World War I, when Britain colonized what was then Palestine, and basically Britain and France, as you know, kind of cut up the Middle East in general, and it was all under those colonial powers. So Zionism was saying, well, we can use, again, in the context of this moment of creating nation states, of minority rights, of people fighting or trying to create these nation states based on existing nationalities, Zionism was saying, we're not going to wait for divine intervention. We're actually going to use modern political means, namely appealing to these colonial powers for the right to be in our ancient homeland. And I'm not going to go through everything that happened next. There were, of course, debates about whether that meant living side by side with the native people there, despite some of the what said to the contrary. Early Zionists were not unaware that there were people living in that area, first subjects to the Ottoman Empire, then under the British Empire. So there were debates about whether it was just being subjects, like just being Ottoman subjects or British subjects like everybody else, whether to create their own state, a binational state. Ultimately, there was a partition plan, there was a war, right? A lot of things happened that are all very complicated. But I just want to say that it's important when we talk about Israel and Zionism to really not just give a pat answer or two simplistic answers, but understand the ways in which, to understand what it means for Jews and the ways in which it was both a continuity and also a break. It's also important to understand the Jewish fear. And the Jewish fear is not just about the legacy of the Holocaust. So of course that is what is in living memory, but also the experience of Jews over thousands of years of being evicted from pretty much every European country that you could name at one point or another, being persecuted, being subject to forced conversion, and that Israel for Jews represents a place that is a refuge, and the Jewish communities even today, whether it's communities in Europe that are worried about increased anti-Semitic attacks, or Ukrainian Jews, or in the 90s, then Soviet Jews, that it's a place that continue, or even today, the last Jews from Afghanistan and Yemen have landed in Israel, that it's a place that continues to be a refuge for Jews. And that is really important to understand that fear. And that is not to, we can understand that fear without taking attention away from Palestinian reality. So we have to talk about both of those things, to say that it is wrong that Palestinians are living under occupation, and to acknowledge why the continued existence of the state of Israel within some borders, those will be determined, God willing, by negotiation between the parties, why that is important to Jews. And so that leads me into talking a little bit more about anti-Semitism, and then I will open up to questions, because I know I've talked a lot and there's probably a lot I've said. I've glossed over a lot of issues. So anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews as Jews. That's a simple definition for a kind of weird word. There's a very long history of anti-Semitism. I'm not going to go through it all. It arguably starts in ancient Egypt, but really takes off with the beginnings of Christianity and the theological question that comes about why Jews still exist when there's Christianity, when there's a New Testament, why are there still these people who are not Christian? And then when the Roman Empire becomes Christian, then there's political power behind that. So this is, I'm not going to dive deep into this history again. If you want to read, I can give you book recommendations if you're interested. We also sent along to the church some little packets that we have about anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism, first, early, I would use the word anti-Judaism, really develops with ideas that come from Christian theology that associate Jews with the devil, that come up with ideas, anti-Semitic hoaxes about blood libel, the idea that Jews use Christian blood, 100% of course not true. It's played out in pretty much everywhere Jews live in Christian Europe, and to a lesser extent in the Muslim world, various restrictions on Jews, whether that's restrictions on what professions they could be in, restrictions on where they could live, if they could own land, if they could have political rights, if they were allowed to have children, like just if they could practice their religion publicly, generally not, but maybe privately or maybe not, right? Just different kinds of restrictions that were very much place-based. I can't go through all the details, but Jews were experiencing that. And then in the 19th century, a couple of major things happen. One is the emancipation of Jews in much of the Western world. So this is really following the French Revolution. The Western world Western Europe starts to emancipate their Jews, which again means all sorts of things in all sorts of places. So maybe in some places Jews get the right to political rights to vote. Maybe in some places they get the right to own land. It was very much by the particular place. Also, the Enlightenment brought about which brought about a new kind of anti-Semitism, because it said basically, if we're not going to ground this in Christianity anymore, because we're not so sure about Christianity, what can we ground it in? And generally ended up saying something to the effect of, oh, well, at least Christians have ethical commandments, but Judaism has nothing, right? So it's a different kind of anti-Semitism that's grounded in Christianity, sometimes while also rejecting Christianity. But really, after the emancipation of Jews, particularly in Germany, the German constitution in the mid-1900s included the emancipation of Jews, even though they didn't actually get rights in all the places where they were. And then Jews were able to assimilate a little bit more, which meant they might wear German dress, they might get the same kind of jobs that other Germans could get, like certain avenues of employment were open to them. Some of them even converted to Christianity. And for anti-Semites, that was especially scary, because how do you know who the Jews are if you can't tell them apart from everybody else? And so the answer comes through a race-based, what became known as anti-Semitism. It's a term that was popularized through a pamphleteer named Wilhelm Marr, not invented by him, but popularized by him, who said, oh, well, Jews are a race, and they're connected to Semitic languages, because Hebrew is a Semitic language. And therefore, I'm going to have this super scientifically based thing called anti-Semitism that will justify my hatred of Jews, or all of our hatred of Jews. He created like a society of anti-Semites. This was a point of pride, not of embarrassment, that is based in race, that says essentially, Jews, it's not about their religious practices. It's not about anything. It's just they are a separate people who, if they're hiding among us, then they're a nefarious, scary influence. And they're actually even more scary when we don't know exactly who they are. So this idea of Jews being a nefarious influence within Christian society. Some other things, I'll just say that one of the other really significant points is at the beginning of the 20th century, the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is probably the most successful anti-Semitic hoax ever published. It still has traction. You can buy a copy on Amazon, please don't. And it purports to be the report of a meeting of all the Jewish elders about how to control the world. And so this has become one of the most significant anti-Semitic tropes that's out there, this idea that there's that Jews are somehow controlling the world. If you even remember the last ad of the Trump campaign in 2016, it had Hillary Clinton, and then it said something like they're managing the levers of power, and then it flashed all of these Jews, right? George Soros and Blankfein, and I forget who else, but Jewish. It was not subtle, and anti-Semites really understood it. Or the Jews will not replace us, right? This idea that Jews are trying to come in and replace white Americans with brown people, right? This idea of Jews moving the levers of power. Okay, so that's like anti-Semitism in 5 minutes. And then finally, how do we fight for justice for Palestinians without crossing the line into anti-Semitism? I've basically hinted at everything that I'm about to say so far. So one piece is making sure that we're not using classic tropes of anti-Semitism, whether that's cartoons of Jews with big noses or ideas of Jews being bloodthirsty or the devil, denying Jewish history. So you see this very often in language like the alleged Jewish temple, right? Or like saying that Jews never had any connection to the land of Israel, or something that is actually, unfortunately, very popular on the left is the idea that today's Jews are not real Jews, that the real Jews of the past disappeared and today's Jews are descended from European converts. That's also an anti-Semitic hoax. I'm not going to get into that, but if you hear it now, you'll recognize it. Seeing Israel as having outsized power, like pulling the strings of the whole world, right? Israel is a country like any country. Let's talk about it according to what it's doing, what it is, including its human rights abuses. Using Zionist when you mean Jew. So it's really important to be clear about what you mean. Are we talking about Israeli Jews? Are we talking about the Israeli government? Are we talking about Jews in general? Are we talking about Jews who support Israel? Like, let's actually talk about what we mean. That's something that particularly sets off an alarm among Jews who remember the Soviet Union, that Stalin used Zionist very much to mean Jew. And so that's something that is definitely triggering. Assuming that all Jews speak for Israel, that Jews, targeting Jews in particular, assuming that Jews can't get up, American Jews can't get up and talk about immigration, for example, without also talking about Israel, and asking Jews to denounce Israel as a condition of engagement in progressive movements. I will say that it is more than 90% of American Jews say that they feel in polling, feel connected to Israel, and Jews, no matter what critiques we have of the state of Israel and the occupation, we're not going to say that the place where half the world's Jewish population lives is, we're not just going to straight up denounce it any more than we're going to say, I think about under the Trump administration, really under any administration, any American administration, we all have lots of critiques of the American government and the human rights abuses, and we can critique. It doesn't mean that we're just going to say, I'm giving up my citizenship as an American, or I'm going to denounce America's even existence in the world. So I just want to go back to what I have said about 1,000 times, which is that we need to start with human beings. It is absolutely appropriate to critique Israel's human rights abuses, which include occupation, it includes displacement of people, it includes building settlements, which is against international law, it includes detentions, administrative detentions, child detentions. I could go on and on. It is absolutely 100% appropriate to critique Israel on that human rights basis, and it's also very important, particularly in Christian communities, to make sure that those critiques don't cross that line into anti-Semitism, and always to go back to this basic principle. There's roughly 14 million people in that region. That includes Israelis, both Jews and Palestinian citizens, and it includes Palestinians living under occupation. And what should be most important to us, our starting point should always be that all of those people are able to exercise their human rights. So I'm going to pause. I know, like I said, I threw out a ton of huge topics, so I'm happy to take questions on all of them.
Thanks, Rabbi Jill. We are open to questions now. I do want to, so if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat room or raise your hand. I can see everybody on my screen other than the parish hall, so you can raise your hand like literally or use the little icon in the parish hall. Just say if you have a question, but while everybody is gathering their thoughts, I'll start with a question, and it's Rabbi Jill, a little more on it's kind of the where you come from in terms of how you end up advocating for human rights for both Palestinians, equality for Palestinians as well as Israelis. It sounds like an obvious thing, right? But
Yeah.
it's not the way that, frankly, most Americans, I'm not talking about Jews or, Christians, but most Americans, I think, have a narrative where Israel's security is kind of paramount and can drive the political outcome. That's my sense of it. You may not agree, but
Yeah.
given that context, is it like things that you observed in personal travel there, or is it coming out of your very, very kind of solid, grounded, progressive and Jewish moral sense of what's right? If you could just tackle
Yeah,
that.
so very much my perspective comes out of a few places. It comes out of my spending a lot of time in the region and with both Israelis and Palestinians, including, just like I said, a week and a half ago, I spent a lot of time in the West Bank with both Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders, including in Masfar Yatta, which is an area that is, there's been a demolition order for 30 years. And the Israeli High Court just ruled a few weeks ago that the demolition order could stand, and there's real fear. There's already been some demolitions during the week that I was there, and there's real fear of massive demolitions and evacuations. So it certainly comes through just talking to people about their lived experience, seeing just that everybody in that place just wants to live and be safe. Like, nobody wants to be in conflict for the most part, other than like the small number of people who actually do want to be in conflict. But most people just want to like wake up in the morning and live their lives. And it also comes from Jewish tradition, that in Jewish tradition, we have a lot of principles about what the responsibility of having our own land is. It's something that God starts talking to us about in the Torah, really right after the liberation from Mitzrayim, from the land of Egypt, of that there's certain responsibilities that come with freedom, and there's responsibilities that come with power. And starting from the Torah and going through all of Jewish tradition, including early Zionist thought and later thought, there's lots of principles that come out about our responsibilities when we have that kind of acquired power. So it certainly comes from that. And I wanted to say something. What was the second part of your question? There was another thing I wanted to say, but now I've besides my own. Oh, about security. So we have to open up this question of security, because a lot of times Israel says that occupation is necessary for security, and I will say that it is a threat to Israel's security. That Israel is sending 18-year-old kids to administer the lives of another people who certainly don't want their lives administered by 18-year-old kids, and are putting people in danger. And I think about my own kids have dual citizenship. They're both Israeli and American. And when and they're 12 and 8. And so when they turn 18, they have the possibility of going into the American army. They have the possibility of going into the Israeli army. Both of those would be choices for them. Since they don't live in Israel, they won't be drafted. They have the possibility of going to college, or whatever 18-year-olds want to do, that we allow. But knowing that some of their cousins in Israel, no matter their political perspectives, don't necessarily have that choice, or there's some limited choices. Knowing that my friends and my family who have grown up in Israel have been in situations that have tested them morally. This idea that it's for Israel's security to put 18-year-olds in that position, just like when we think about the wars that the U.S. has been in over the last 2 decades, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, and how many, I'm going to say kids, because we're talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds have died. Was that for America's security? I don't think so. And so first, there's that question of what's actually security. Second, when you I'm thinking about, there have been a few called lone wolf terror attacks in the last number of weeks in Israel. Just one Palestinian with an axe or a gun, killing really kind of randomly. And so what drives somebody to do that? It's desperation. I mean, I'm not going to psychoanalyze people, but it's often desperation of living under occupation. And so Israel, there is no military solution to those kind of attacks. There's only a political solution. That's the same when we talk about what happens when there's a flare up with Gaza, with Israel bombing Gaza and Gaza sending rockets into civilian areas in Israel. Both of those are human rights abuses. There is no military solution. It's a political solution. And the last thing I would say is that Israel is currently a country without borders. And most countries have borders and you can defend your borders. So if, like, God forbid, Canada decided to attack the United States, I don't think it would happen, but we know where the border is, right? We know what we're defending. But in Israel, it's amorphous and you can't defend not having borders. And Israel knows how to be at war without occupation. So Israel has, thank God, a peace, it's maybe a cold peace, but it's a peace with Egypt and with Jordan. Those were two of the best political decisions made by the leaders of those countries at the time. I don't think there's political leadership that could have made those decisions now. There's peace. Israel is technically at war with Syria and Lebanon. Obviously in Lebanon there was, and I'm not going to go into this, but there was an occupation. But Israel is technically at war with some of its other neighboring countries, but without occupation and settlement. With Lebanon, there wasn't Israeli civilian settlement inside of Lebanon. It was a different situation. But it is possible. Israel knows how to be at war with neighboring countries without also occupying them. Somebody asked, do I think that there will be a political solution? I mean, I am not a prophet, and I certainly hope so. Do I think there'll be a political solution to anything? Do I think Ukraine, Russia? I don't know. I don't know anything, but I do know that the current situation is unsustainable. And I know that once upon a time, there were political leaders who were able and willing to take huge risks, in some cases, even losing their lives in order to push forward a political solution. So I have to believe that that is possible.
Thanks, Rabbi Jill. I want to follow up. Oh, I see. Great. The parish hall has their hand up. So over to you for that question, Nancy.
Yeah, I want to go back to where you started, Rabbi, talking about how Oslo was a key point in your sort of sense of the region and the hope. And go back to the story that, in fact, it's a true story, that at the same time Oslo was happening, there were a group of primarily women on both sides, Palestinian and Israeli, who were trying to meet in Morocco, I think it was, maybe it was Tunisia, to try to work through a peace with, the broad sort of perspective of women who were tired of their kids getting killed.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Oslo happened without their knowledge. But I want to come back to what you think is the role that women can play in particular in trying to neutralize the situation on the ground, to try to bring a little bit more, dare I say, humanity to the situation of looking at the other. And just whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I remember once hearing somebody who had sat at many international peace negotiation tables, somebody from the human rights world, say that she could tell that, she said, if there were a woman at the table, she knew that the peace agreement would hold, and if there weren't, that it wouldn't. And that has really stuck with me. And I think it's very much true. And there are, we don't have a women negotiated peace agreement on the table. I think it would be awesome. I think it could be the thing that would work. But there are these efforts, like there's something called Women Wage Peace that is, I think, entirely Israeli citizens, so Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel, that is very much them saying we are super sick of this and we want a political solution, not a military solution. And that's been happening for a number of years. And they've been advocating to Knesset and putting pressure on Knesset. And then this is not just women, but involves a lot of women, really heartbreakingly, the bereaved parents circle, which some of you might have encountered, which is family. It's not only parents. I think maybe it's called bereaved families, but it's families, both Jewish and Palestinian families who have lost loved ones, children, and others who have come together in that grief. And it's really painful. I mean, I wish it didn't have to exist, but it's really painful. I was just on Zoom, one of every year they do on Yom HaZikaron, which is the Israeli Memorial Day, they do a ceremony that used to be just in person and now is on Zoom with like tens of thousands of people, if not more, watching from around the world, of Israelis and Palestinians mourning their families. And so it's definitely one of the most horrible and painful and powerful experiences of the year to watch that ceremony. So I do very much, and there's other smaller projects that involve bringing together women and families. So for sure that has to be part of it. It can't just be the male leaders. I mean, unfortunately, both of these places have primarily been led by male leaders.
Thanks, Rabbi Jill. And there's a question from Barbara in the chat room. Does equal rights for Palestinians include courts of justice made up of their peers?
Yeah, I mean, so for Palestine, I'm not exactly sure what the question is asking, but I'll try to answer it. But for Palestinians who are living in, I mean, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza are under different legal situations, but let's just take the West Bank, which is still, as a legacy of Oslo, divided into A, B, and C areas. A is under PA control, B, though it's still under the West Bank, which is under Israeli control, but the PA controls daily life, which includes the courts. Area C, which is under full Israeli control, which means which means that the courts are military courts, and B, where there's Israeli so-called security control and Palestinian civil control. It's actually kind of a mess, to be honest. And so right now, and it's different for East Jerusalem residents who have a particular residency. It's different for Gaza, who are living under now Hamas control. So I don't know if this is what the ask is, but if a Palestinian is arrested if a Palestinian area C is arrested by the military, they're in an Israeli military court, which has like a 99% conviction rate. And it is certainly not, I mean, there's lawyers in there, they can negotiate things, but it is certainly not justice. And I would hope a Palestinian state will have to make its own systems and make its own court systems, and those will be whatever they'll be, but they will be Palestinian court systems, as it should be. They'll be probably just as bad as all the other court systems around the world.
Thank you. Rabbi Jill, I want to ask a question. This is going to test your kind of political acumen a little bit,
Okay.
but it seems to me that there's been like growth in the progressive movement on rights for Palestinians over the last 10 years or so. I don't know, I personally think some of that was kind of a reaction to Netanyahu and the way he kind of polarized American politics by siding with the Republican Party fairly overtly. And so it kind of created a reaction on the Democratic Party side. And then more recently, there's the Trump administration, and that kind of polarized American politics as well. And Trump did some overtly pro-Israeli things that may have furthered that progressive movement. So now
I would say pro-Netanyahu. Let's leave aside what's pro-Israel.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. But so the point in leading up to the question is that now Netanyahu's kind of out of the picture politically. He may be coming back, but we're not there yet. Same with Trump. Has that if the premise is accurate, maybe it's not, but has that kind of progressive momentum met its kind of potential, or what do you see going on is really the question that's feeding movement towards equal rights, equal respect for Palestinians as well as Israelis that you clearly are part of from your vantage point?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the accumulation of a lot of things. So under Netanyahu, he was prime minister for not consecutive, but for 12 years. It's a long time in a 74-year-old country. And I think it's an accumulation of so many things. So he went on an all-out war against, even within Israel, against human rights organizations, against Palestinian citizens of Israel, and then, of course, expanded occupation and even threatened formal annexation, which would have been a new violation of international law. So for sure, just that despair of Netanyahu, and he just abandoned any pretense of being interested in a peace agreement, or, he said, like, there'll never be two states, right? So he just abandoned any of that. So it's that. It's also just more and more years of not progress, of occupation. It's the certainly the 2014 war with Gaza, with Hamas, was a factor, I think, particularly for younger people who don't remember the hope of Oslo and don't remember the Second Intifada, and remember, whose encounter really begins in 2014. And when we just had those horrific and inexcusable pictures of so many people killed, including children, and buildings demolished in Gaza. So it's despair over nothing getting better. It's another bunch of years. It's Netanyahu. It was Trump just going on taking the position of the most right wing, taking the most right wing perspective, and coming up with his so-called peace plan, which would have been a nightmare. And also, I mean, now there's this very fragile Israeli government, which, as you said, could fall apart in the next few weeks, and most likely will fall apart before, even if they manage to hold on, they're not going to be able to pass a budget in December. So it'll fall apart sometime between now and December. It's not clear who could get a majority in that case. But it's this very fragile government that has at its head Naftali Bennett, who is ideologically possibly to the right of Netanyahu or identical. He's certainly very pro-settlement, and also has a Palestinian political party in it, Palestinian Citizens of Israel. It's really crucial to understand the role of Palestinian Citizens of Israel. This is the first time they've officially been in a government, though they supported the Rabin government from the outside. And Oslo was able to happen because Palestinian citizens supported the government from the outside. It's like in the political, shenanigans or negotiations. And it's not the Palestinian Israeli political party that's in is not the one that is sort of coming out of the communist tradition and the more progressive tradition. It's the one that's conservative, at least on social issues. And there also the left, the liberal Israeli Jewish parties are in. Like, it's a very weird government, and the only thing that they agree on is not Netanyahu. They have no ideological commonalities really, other than not Netanyahu. So it was fragile from the beginning by just a bare majority, which they don't even have anymore. Actually, one of the defectors just came back in, but they're barely hanging on. So I think it's a lot of that despair. Yeah, I will also say, this is just a separate point that you didn't ask about, because I was talking about the government. Something that is super misunderstood in the US is the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel, who again are 20% of the population. Those are people who they're sometimes called Israeli Arabs or Arab Israelis, or 48 Palestinians, or Palestinian citizens. Just, every person is going to tell you a different thing that they want to be called. But people who stayed, who weren't expelled during the Nakba, who stayed, they were under military occupation until 67. Now they're full citizens. And there's also structural discrimination. I think that sometimes a lot of the rhetoric about them, in the US, is either casting them as in exactly the same political situation as Palestinians living under occupation, which is not true because they have full citizenship, they vote, they have political parties. One of the political parties that represents that community is actually the only reason we have a government, right? All of those things. Other sides say like, oh, but there's full, equality. Look at these Palestinian citizens who, have graduated highest in the class from, Tel Aviv University, law school, or wherever. And that's also not true because there's still structural discrimination and there's lots of reasons for that. But it's also, I think something that's really important is like people are really ignoring on all sides what the Palestinian citizens are actually saying. And most of what they're actually saying right now has to do with a desire for, has to do with violence that's happening inside of their own communities. There have been, I'm not sure even how many murders, deaths, including of women in domestic violence situations, including through different kinds of organized crime or gangs. And the Palestinian citizens are basically saying to the state of Israel, we need more funding. We need more funding for social programs. We need more funding for education. We need funding. We need policing. We need real policing. We need you to take the issues happening in our community seriously, not just say like, we don't really care if there's violence there. And I think that's just really important it's always important to listen to what the people on the ground are saying, but sometimes what the people on the ground are saying isn't actually fitting into one simplistic political narrative.
Thank you. I wanted to open it for one final question before we close. If anyone has a question, if not,
I think we're done here. So
okay.
People.
All right. Well, then I'll ask the last question. Rabbi Jill, we're looking to do some interfaith-based advocacy work. And one of the things that we've been talking about here on our Holy Land Committee, and we've actually drafted an information paper on this subject, is linking U.S. aid to Israel to Israeli behavior, particularly things like settlement building. The overall aim of this would be to do something tangible to roll back the occupation.
Yeah. So I have two thoughts for you. Sorry. Was there more to the question?
Well, I think that's the gist of it. So over to you.
So we as an organization are supporting Andy Levin's Two-State Act, which you can take a look at that. It reaffirms the US's commitment to two states. It also does say that US aid can't be used for certain practices like demolitions and things like that. And it also would allocate more US money for civil society projects to build up, particularly Palestinian civil society. It has a very long road, if any road, but we're a people of hope, and so I recommend that as something that has to check. I don't know offhand. You can check whether your members of Congress are co-sponsors, but that's something that is important to support. And the other thing is that there are projects in the region. You probably know this, but there's projects in the region that are literally saving the lives of people every day. I mean, just a week and a half ago, I was in one village, Tuba, and in the West Bank and the South Hebron Hills, and there's a big, we call it a wind turbine by Comet, this German company that is doing solar power. They also had solar panels, so they were able to have internet, and so they're doing solar panels and wind turbines and things like that in Palestinian villages. It's very concrete. It's something that you can raise money for, that you can support. It has a massive impact on people's lives, and you can see the impact. Or even if there's a village that the members of your church have adopted to have visited, to just say to them, what is it that you need, and to actually put material support, even though that's not going to solve the whole the whole occupation anytime soon. It does have a real and positive impact on people's lives.
Thank you. I will say, since you asked the question, our Congressman Jamie Raskin, I believe he's
Oh,
a
good.
co-sponsor of the two-state solution. I would say that within our Holy Land Committee, there's discussion over the merits of the two-state solution. All of us want a political resolution that's beneficial to Israelis and Palestinians, just for both of them, justice for both peoples. Personally, just to kind of like, I liked, Rabbi Jill, when you talked about the two-state approach earlier, that you said that the focus needs to be on equal rights for both people, because I'm just reading into your kind of rationale for that the two-state approach isn't really going anywhere, it seems. And so that skepticism about it is kind of where a lot of us are coming from on the Holy Land Committee.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say,
that's,
yeah.
Mhm.
No, sorry, go
That's
ahead.
why that's just why we're focused more on advocacy for human rights, equality, and even advocacy for ending the occupation, because my view is that humanitarian assistance is just putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger wound than a Band-Aid can address. And so the root cause of the suffering needs to be addressed.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm also, and also the Band-Aid does save people's lives in the short term. So it's always a balance. I'll say just two things just for closing, like we don't have time, I know, to go into two states. I'll say that the Two-State Act has material implications, whether or not you like the language. So just that I think are positive. I would also say there's a lot of dismissal of two states. I hear a lot, well, we tried that and didn't work. And my answer is we never tried it. There was a move toward maybe eventually getting there. Maybe Oslo would have gotten there. And I'll also say that if two states is not going anywhere, which I agree right now it is not, one democratic state is really not going anywhere. And I just want to be, to say that if Israel is not willing to accept two states, which would preserve Israeli autonomy and sovereignty and the ability to be a Jewish state in some boundaries, there's no way that they're going to give up their sovereignty and autonomy. So I just want to be a realist about that. One book that I would definitely recommend is Gershon Shafir's book called, I think it's called Half Century of Occupation. And he's a professor at one of the University of Californias, I can't remember which one. And I'll say he's coming from the left of me, and he's a very strong critic of Israel. And he goes through all the possibilities and says in the end that two states is the only one that has any hope. And so I definitely would recommend looking at that. But personally, the other book that I very much would recommend is, it's not about two states, but super important book by Hillel Cohen. It's called Year Zero, and it's about 1929, the different riots, attacks. There were Jews killed, there were Palestinians killed. It was really, anyway, as he posits that that's the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think that's also really important to understand where the fear is. And, it's very nice to think like maybe there could be some multicultural state where, everybody is like kumbaya and living together and it protects everybody's rights. But we don't have evidence that is, we have no historical precedent of that happening. And I personally am very afraid that there would be many, many deaths if that actually were on the table. So I just want to say that as you can keep talking about it, but just that's my kind of pragmatic word about two states.
That's fair. Thank you. Okay, Rabbi Jill, just want to say, can't really thank you enough for the generosity of your time and the give and take here, the discussion, and we really appreciate the learned and educational perspective that you brought to us this morning on Judaism and this issue in Israel-Palestine. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everybody else who joined us as well. Hope you had a good,
Thanks from the parish
uh,
hall.
Thank you so much for being here. It's great to be with you.